just briefly, Clover is not only a great activist and the founder of Force of Nature, and I invite you to Google also the organization, but she's also an impressive speaker and someone that Colomba and I have followed for many, many years since we met, I think, in 2020 at a conference, or 2021 at a conference. And you can read on the slide in front of you many of her achievements, but I think that hearing from her will be the best way to explore the topic ahead of us. And together with Clover, which I'm gonna now spotlight, I'm gonna stop sharing the screen. We're gonna hear from, and we're gonna have a moderator from Kenya. There is actually Clive, the person that I was referring to before, who has worked for UNEP, is a very informed as well climate activist. So I think it's gonna make for a great conversation. Welcome, Clover.
Thank you so much for having me. Excited to connect with all of you.
Yeah, welcome. And yeah, it is really amazing to have you on this session. And this topic that you want to discuss, it's very, very critical. And majorly, it is a reflection on what is happening globally, political apathy and climate, and how it affects our current world, and how it's affecting the democratic process globally. So I'll just briefly introduce what political apathy on climate is. So the political apathy on climate, basically, it is lack of interest, concerns, and actions among the politicians and the general public regards to climate change and environmental issues. And this apathy can manifest in various ways, such as reluctance to prioritize climate policies, voters' disinterest in climate-related political agendas, or insufficient engagement with scientific data and environmental activism. And over the years, we've been seeing that there's been a rise in voters' apathy, majorly in reflection to climate or environmental concerns. As you all know, that climate change is being accelerated, and it is having diverse impacts on vulnerable communities or on various ecosystems. And I think personally, we view this has accelerated effects on even the democracy, global systems and governance, from the reduced voters' turnout, erosion of accountability, and also undermining the global cooperation that you've all been seeking to tackle all the environmental and global challenges of our time. So the first question to you is, how have you ever seen a politician that did drive our planet? And if yes, who?
Good question to start off with, because I think there are so many incredible people who are have been fighting this fight for a really long time, a lot longer than you and I have even been on the planet. And there are so many more people who have kind of been outside of the corridors of power who are starting to engage in politics. And I think in response to seeing many people in positions of power who are not responsive to the needs of communities. So I feel like we're at an interesting moment where the lines between the average person and a politician are much more blurred than they might have once been. In terms of who I draw inspiration from, this is going to be very kind of UK centric because it's where I've lived for the past 7 years, and also US centric just because I feel like it's impossible to escape US politics. But the first few people who come to mind, I think one is obviously Bernie Sanders. Not to be a cliche, but I do think he has just such an incredible track record of really being a voice for the most vulnerable communities. And I think often climate has really been almost separated out from the needs of people and from human rights and social justice. And I feel like throughout his career as a politician, he's always married those things. He's made it very, very clear that we're not going to be able to protect nature or protect the environment without people and without, ensuring that people can live, flourishing and abundant lives. And also, we can't survive on a burning planet. So I went to a really interesting rally, actually, of Bernie's back in 2020, and it was in Detroit. which is a community that has really been impoverished in the past, few decades, is now facing a lot of major social issues. And he just did a really effective job of centering the voices of the working class communities in that geography, and ensuring that when we're talking about, a transition to renewables, to more sustainable ways of living, we're really talking about a just transition. So, communities that have been, coal mining or industrial communities for decades, how do we ensure that they're not left behind? So Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, of course, very inspiring as well. I think as an example of someone who's very young, who's come outside of politics and into the fold. I just love her because she's not afraid of asking really difficult questions. She doesn't tiptoe around the issues. And then I think within the UK, a couple of people, Jeremy Corbyn, I find him inspiring because I think he has shown that he's willing to go against his own kind of party on issues where his personal values digress. An example of that is speaking out about the genocide in Palestine. He has a long track record of lobbying for the rights of Palestinians, lobbying for a free Palestine, even when it meant that he was essentially evicted from his role as head of the Labour Party. And then someone else who maybe is less known is Mete Coburn, who's a friend of mine actually, who has been a Labour councillor for a borough called Stoke Newington. He is very much from outside of the world of politics, but one day he decided to get involved. He started a nonprofit called My Life, My Say, which is all about getting young people to vote. They did a great campaign called Give an X, which is largely responsible for the largest ever youth turnout in the local elections this year. And just today, it was announced that he has been chosen by Sadiq Khan, the mayor of London, to be the deputy mayor for the environment, which is really, really exciting. And Mete had no kind of political background before he became a councillor. He just saw that people like him were not representative in politics, and he wanted to be a voice for his community. So I find it really interesting, as a friend of his, to kind of follow his journey and to also hear from the inside, the different kind of like power structures that exist within politics, how prohibitive it can be, the money that you need, even if you want to run for politics in this country. But I think people like Mete are really disrupting that and inviting more people to get involved.
Yeah, amazing. Talking about power structures within politics, this drives us to our second question on which role can politicians play mostly in mobilizing people for climate action? Or is it not even about mobilizing people for climate action because politicians should just tackle the biggest polluters themselves?
Yeah, it's a great question. I feel like it's easy to forget in today's political climate, which can feel like such a circus. But the job of politicians is to represent the needs of everyday people. Like we are electing them there to stand up for what is important, to safeguard our future. And yet increasingly what we have seen is politicians who are choosing to create, political chasms, who are choosing to kind of stoke this polarization within politics, and who are also, I think this feels especially relevant in the UK, kind of in a toxic relationship with the media, who kind of like hand in hand create very convenient scapegoats for them to blame their political failings on. So we've seen that in the UK in the lead up to the election. The Tory government, which was in power for 14 years, failing to tackle poverty, not funding public housing, underfunding the NHS, not funding training for jobs, not supporting mental health services, and meanwhile creating, tax breaks for corporations and the wealthy, blaming the symptoms of all those issues and that underfunding, like the cost of living crisis and inflation, long wait times on the NHS, on things like immigration, which are completely unrelated. But they did a really effective job hand in hand with the media of vilifying people. And, Rishi Sunak led this campaign of Stop the Boats, which was just the most callous and kind of immoral thing I've ever seen in politics. You know, really trying to dehumanize people who are fleeing horrendous circumstances, and who are just, you know, seeking safe passage. So I think we're currently in that landscape. And so the politicians that we do have need to be held to account. And we also need to ensure that those politicians are not kind of fortressed behind, you know, some major wall, but have direct interface with the people that they are there to actually represent, and not the shadowy figures like the Rupert Murdochs of the world, who have such an influence over our media and our kind of cultural narratives. And for me, you know, I find a lot of hope in different kind of political systems that enable that voice for the people. I think a great example is like deliberative democracy and citizens' assemblies. How do we actually hear from everyday people in community and translate their needs and aspirations into policy that doesn't serve an elite few people, but serves the majority of people? And I think the recent election, again, to focus on the UK, we saw, you know, massive losses to the Tories, but also, you know, it wasn't so much a vote for Labour, who are now the party in charge, as a vote against the Tories and a vote for something different. And we saw that with like historic wins for the Liberal Democrats and also for the Greens. It shows that people feel really disillusioned by, you know, the two major parties that have kind of been vying for power, and want to see much more radical and inspiring approaches. So in answer to your question, I would say politicians need to remember who they are responsible to, and we need to ensure that we're not afraid of holding them to account.
Yes, yes, indeed. We are not afraid to hold them to account. And yeah, just reiterating on your question, I think, yeah, it's very, very important to enhance, you know, tangible policies, again, as you mentioned, that's, you know, help in mobilizing public goodwill to strengthen engagement, and also putting leaders into account in formulating comprehensive approach that brings together efforts to tackle all these planetary challenges that we have. And so, in our next question, what are the sentiments that can push the public to move beyond apathy and believe that climate crisis can be tackled or can be killed? And yeah, this question is more of calling for urgency in how it can be cultivated by communicating the immediate and tangible impacts of climate change, such as extreme weather events, rising sea level. And yeah, I think it's really, really amazing to hear your view on this question.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think it's very normal to look at the climate crisis and feel really powerless and feel super overwhelmed. It is a huge problem, and I think particularly this younger generation coming through, better than any previous generation, understand the intersectionality of all the different problems that make up the climate crisis. And when I think about climate, I think of it as an umbrella term, right? Because ultimately it is a crisis of racial injustice, of gender injustice, and bigger than that even, it's, you know, a crisis of deep-seated inequality. It's a symptom of, you know, colonial structures that exploited certain communities of people for the benefit and wealth of a small few. And we see those systems and patterns continually playing out, even and maybe especially so within the climate movement and the types of solutions that are being put forward. So I think with that recognition that the climate crisis intersects with every facet of our lives, from the clothes we wear to the food we eat to how we get around the places we live, or frankly who we elect into power, it can be really easy to feel like, oh my gosh, it's too much. But I think what's important to remember is that we already have all of the solutions that we need to address the climate crisis. We have the technology that we need. We have the resources that we need. Last year, fossil fuel subsidies, so the amount the government spends on propping up fossil fuel globally, reached $7 trillion US. Meanwhile, it's estimated that to change the entire global energy infrastructure and move it entirely to renewables, we need about $4.5 trillion to be invested per year by 2030. So actually, a fraction of what we're currently spending on fossil fuels and oil and gas. So again, it's not as if the money doesn't exist. It is simply being funneled into the wrong things, because the people who benefit from the current system, which is a fossil fuel system, do not want to give that up. And they want to, extract as much oil and gas as they possibly can until the last possible moment. So all to say, I think it's really, really important to remind ourselves that the solutions are there, the resources are there, the finance is there. Honestly, the biggest barrier is that of political will. And I think our political systems are not well engineered to respond to the climate crisis through a couple of different dimensions. I think for one, in terms of timeline, the climate crisis, we've now known about it since the 60s and 70s. We've had several decades to address this crisis. But it is a long-term threat. And until, more recently, it was quite abstract. Now we're already seeing, of course, the impacts of the climate crisis, particularly in the most vulnerable communities in the global south. But it is long-term. And when you compare that to short-term election cycles, 3 or 4 year cycles, politicians are in the business of responding to things that feel very, very immediate and feel very urgent. And there's an entire system around them, from, media and short-term cycles to financial cycles, right? Not just yearly, but quarterly financial cycles, through to even the fast pace of social media that keeps policymakers in a very reactive kind of state. The second thing, and this is something that Atlas obviously focuses on, is international cooperation. It's no secret that the climate crisis, the people who have contributed the least of this climate crisis are already paying its worst impacts, predominantly countries in the global south and the most vulnerable people and communities among them. And so we have a matter of global injustice, where the countries that are really perpetuating and have done so historically this problem are not going to be the ones facing its worst impacts. And that's why political collaboration across borders, across country lines is so, so important, and why we also need to look at historic reparations. So, countries like the UK, who have already benefited from their industrial revolution, are financing the economic transition and evolution of countries that haven't had that benefit, and if anything, have been kept and held back because of the colonization of countries like the UK. So I really think we need to focus on, again, what are systems and structures that help us to surpass those things, that help us to surpass borders, that get us out of this kind of us versus them type mentality. And again, if we look at solutions, all of the most promising solutions are those that have both short-term, immediate outcomes and benefits, but we need to be able to tell those stories a lot better. And one of the solutions and resources that I find really, really compelling, it's called regeneration. Both the term of what regeneration means, not just do less harm, but do more good, but also regeneration.org. It's an amazing website. And it's the most comprehensive plan of solutions ever put forward. And again, it straddles both, social crises and environmental crises. So it looks at the power of educating girls, for example, the impact that that has on the environment and on people. It looks at how we actually rewild the most deforested parts of the world. And what's really cool as well is that it doesn't just look at these issues on a really macro level. It looks at who the bad actors are. So who are the corporations that are contributing most to these problems, who need to be held to account. They've also done something quite cheeky, which is include the contact information for the CEOs of those companies so that you can directly contact them. And critically, it doesn't just show the bad actors, it shows who are already leading on the solutions. And every single area, whether it's tackling plastic pollution or fast fashion or the palm oil industry, it shows clearly who is leading the way, and what do solutions need to look like, not only on a local level, but a political level and a global level as well.
Very cool, Clover. Clive is frozen, so actually it's perfect to
This
jump
is
in right now.
fascinating.
Clive, I think you were frozen.
Okay.
Do you mind if I ask a quick question?
Yep, yep. Yeah,
So
sure.
Clover, I know you speak a lot about the UK, but I also know you are Australian. So I would like to know.
A well-kept secret.
I would like I would like to know if there is any good sign coming from Australia as well, because obviously it's one of the more biodiverse country with a lot of oil as well produced there. So it would be very, and we have an Australian team that's very active. So we would love to hear from you about that.
Amazing. It's a great question. I mean, we're in a much better position politically than when Australia had Scott Morrison at the helm. That was very scary, as yeah, a politician who was overtly racist, xenophobic, and pretty open climate denier. We now have Albanese, Albo, as he's referred to in Australia, and he has brought in some really good policies on climate and the environment. A lot of local politicians have really pushed him to be more ambitious as well. However, unfortunately, Australia is still subsidizing heavily the oil and gas industry. It's really subsidizing mining. There is a very strong voice in Australia on behalf of the mines, and there's been very little meaningful discussion about what a just transition looks like for communities that are, mining communities and have been for a long time. I think another area that Australia needs to do a lot better is in centering the voices of the people who have been historically marginalized, and particularly First Nations people in Australia. We're the only colonizing country, if you look at New Zealand, Canada, America, who do not have any Indigenous representation in our parliament in terms of enshrined into law that there is a degree of representation. And Albanese put forward a motion to change that, and unfortunately it was voted against. And that's an area of leadership where I really questioned, a bit like the gay vote in Australia as well, why is this something that we even need to put to the public? We're the only country that doesn't have this enshrined, and so we should just do it, right? Rather than opening it out into some kind of moralistic argument. It's like, I think we can accept as a culture that this is the very least we can do, considering our history. I think in final answer to your question, where I see more hope is definitely among young people in Australia. I think they are super political. I think they're more and more kind of outspoken. And again, I'm seeing many more young people engage directly in politics. And Australia is a small enough country by population that if you do get into politics, you can have a pretty major influence. And Australia as a country, in spite of its population, has really strong soft power as well globally. So I really implore young Australians to get active politically and to make sure their voices are heard.
Yeah, so talking about politics, do you have advice or recommendations for a new political movement, basically regards to, all trying to tackle all these environmental, democratic, political issues, maybe recommendations on it?
It's a great question. A few things I would say, building off what I was sharing earlier, which is very much at the heart of the Atlas movement, is to ensure it's international, right? I'm quite what might be considered radical in that I really don't think nations should exist as a concept. I think, very arbitrary lines have been drawn on a global map, often and by colonizers, and they do more harm than good. And I think, if we look at climate, for example, where we're seeing some of the greatest leadership, it's not perfect, obviously, but is at the supranational level. When you have structures like the EU, I think they're very powerful because they bring together a range of different perspectives and ideas, and it enables people to kind of set aside the country that they are there to kind of represent. So I think down with nations, that we might be a little ways off that. So I'd say greater international cooperation. I think always, and I try to do this all the time in my work. You know, when you walk into a room, ask who's not in the room, who is not represented there, and how do we center those voices? You know, I think even as a young person in this movement, although maybe I'm aging out of the bracket of like youth activist now that I'm 25, but so often you'll kind of ask like, oh, what do young people care about? And it's frankly such a ridiculous question because we're not some homogenous group. You know, we're striated by geography and privilege and economic opportunity and lived experience, relationship to climate change, all of these different things. And so rather than trying to get, you know, single spokespeople to share on behalf of an entire generation, we need those voices in the room. And so always ensuring that we're hearing from a diversity of voices. I think, you know, working in the nonprofit space, a lot of charity structures are still very colonial in that they're, you know, often run by organizations in the global north, which presume to know what communities in the global south need when it comes to responding to the climate crisis. And of course, what we see is the most effective and sustainable solutions are always, always, always those led and directed by people on the ground, right? They know what they need, and what we can do to kind of bridge the resource gap is ensure that those of us who do have access to resources are really serving as a conduit for those resources into communities that don't have them. I think the other thing is it's just important when thinking about a sort of global movement to recognize, again, the diversity in that and the fact that there isn't going to be one message that resonates with everyone. I see that a lot in climate. You know, the conversation is kind of gate kept behind terms like net zero and 1.5 and a lot of technical jargon that doesn't really connect with people's everyday lives, the things they're struggling with, the things they aspire for. And so making sure that we're putting in the effort to travel to people and not expect them to come to us and really understand, you know, what the needs and values are of people and community, and critically what the through lines are. You know, what actually connects us, what is universal. I think, you know, when I've sat down with people who have very different politics to me, it doesn't actually take that long to find common ground. I think social media gives us a very warped idea because, you know, we become like talking heads who just have very unnuanced kind of points of view. But if you sit down with someone, you know, generally all of the same things are important, right? Community, connection, access to nature, you know, good livelihoods. And so I think we need to stop hiding behind abstract words that are increasingly kind of polarized and politicized and just speak to what everyday people need and want and the solutions that are going to directly address those needs.
Yes, yes, incredibly amazing. Yeah, then you're in the right place to be an Atlas member as well. Yeah. So before we jump to the last question, we're going to open the floor for first round of questions, and then we will rush to the last question. So the first question from the chat, it's from first question from the chat is from Pi. With every year of record temperatures, it feels like global warming has become unstoppable. Every climate action to stop airports, roads, or vandalized artwork is met with some degree of public backlash. The European Greens have suffered major losses in these elections. I feel desperate. How can we cope with such situation?
Yeah, thank you for the very honest and vulnerable question. I will try to speak to it from a really personal standpoint. It's okay to feel despair sometimes and to feel disillusioned and hopeless. I often find myself in that headspace because I think we see certain wins, like, you know, in the UK, in France. I was so relieved by the recent election results. And at the same time, we see real fracturing and real polarization. And exactly as you highlighted, we see activists being arrested, sentenced for, you know, 4 to 5 years for peaceful protest in the UK. And that makes me feel really, really upset, and it makes me feel really powerless a lot of the time. And I think often as an activist, and I know this is not a unique experience, kind of questioning like, what's the point, right? And am I even making a difference? And I've had conversations with friends of mine who have been environmentalists for decades, and I ask them, I'm like, you were talking about this stuff when you were kind of laughed out of the room for being a hippie. Like, how have you kept going even when by so many measures we're kind of going backwards? And what I've learned through them is that it's really important to kind of let go of the outcome. That might sound counterintuitive, but we really have to think about our activism through the lens of sustainability, right? How do you show up in a way where no matter the outcome, whether it's a bill you're protesting or a petition you're getting signatures for, or you yourself running for office, getting politically active, no matter what the outcome, you'll still be able to show up, no matter what. And I think that resilience is going to be increasingly important. I think it's also really important from a mental health perspective, because we can't attach our worth as people or the value of our actions to the outcomes. And this is why I get really frustrated by a lot of the language around the 1.5 degree tipping point and like the doomsday clock of we have 10 years to save the planet and now 5 and then 2. Because what happens then, right? If we hit that decade point and by, every estimate as it currently stands, we fail to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, does that mean that we just, give up and just throw the towel in? And I think anytime I hear myself veering in that direction, I realize, at least for me personally, it's born from such a place of privilege, right? I have the privilege to contemplate whether I keep going as an activist, when the reality is so many people around the world are simply trying to survive. They are, desperate, and they're backed into a corner. They don't get that choice. And so I bear upon me this responsibility of taking action. And I think any of us who have the privilege to engage, we owe it to ourselves, and we owe it to future generations. We owe it to the most vulnerable in our society, to keep showing up. And a final thing I will say to this, I practice Buddhism. I have found it really essential to my activism. And it's a real practice in acting not for some external reason, but simply for the fact that it's the right thing to do, and knowing that that is enough. And sometimes I ask leaders, whether I'm talking to politicians or business leaders, for them, you reach a certain point in your life where you start to think about your legacy. You start to think, if you have children, what am I going to hand over to them? And my question is always, what do you want to see when you look back on your life? Regardless of where we land, do you want to look back and see someone who chose to sit on the sidelines, either from a place of denial or despair? Or do you want to be someone who, in the face of such devastation and also such difficult odds, chose to do something? And then the final thing I will say, I think so much of activism today is kind of like enshrined in this idea of the individual and individualism, right? And we see that when it comes to sustainability and climate, the kind of actions you're encouraged to take. It's like, don't fly, don't eat meat, change your light bulbs. And that narrative has largely been shaped by oil and gas companies like BP, who created the carbon footprint calculator, to kind of keep us focused on the small stuff, rather than looking at the system that perpetuates these crises, rather than interrogating the people who benefit from those systems, and focusing on institutional change. And if we look to history, if we look to the movements that gave us the right to vote, if we look to the suffragettes, if we look to the civil rights movement, if we look to the Stonewall Uprising, these were people-powered movements. It wasn't one person. Yes, you can think of the Martin Luther King or the Rosa Parks, these incredible figureheads, but they were part of movements made up of hundreds of thousands of people who chose to refuse the status quo and who chose to go against business as usual, even when for many of them it meant huge social sacrifice, or as is the case for many environmental defenders, it meant forfeiting their lives, and it still means forfeiting their lives. These are people who act in collective to fight for the majority. And so that for me is also where I draw inspiration, is knowing that I am part of this legacy of so many people who have come before me, who have faced, you know, even worse odds, who have struggled. And I may not see the outcomes of my actions in my lifetime, but I know that I'm going to be part of this continuation that hands that baton on to the next generation. Sorry for the long answer,
thank you.
but it's a big question.
Yeah, I think this has really been an amazing and inspiration session. And maybe I think Coloman and Andrea, we need to reorganize another session, mostly to speak on apathy on political issues and climate, because I think this is a very critical topic. Because on my side, we had 2 more questions, but I think mostly Colum and Andrea, you can see maybe how they can be answered in the chat. And on my end, this has really been an amazing moderating session with you, and we look forward to another session. And in respect of time, I want to pass the mic back to Andrea and Colum. It has been amazing moderating this session. My name is Clive Donnley, a member of Atlas in Kenya, and also a consultant at TUNEP in Nairobi, Kenya. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Clive, and especially, of course, thank you so much, Clover. A big round of applause. I can make also the noise. It's been very inspiring, and I think that very motivating for our activists and members, Clover. So thank you so much. And definitely I'm going to invite you again, because clearly there's a lot of support from your ideas and your perspective. So
Thank you for hosting me, and thank you, Clive, for moderating, and a huge testament to everything you're doing at Atlas. This is absolutely what we need more of, more collaboration, cooperation, and so great to see so many young people politically involved. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Clover. Have a nice Friday and speak soon again. I'm gonna now share the screen for